Lovely. So good morning, everyone. My name's Georgina Whelan and I am the ACT Emergency Services Agency Commissioner. Prior to that, I had 2 years as the Chief Officer for ACT SES. And I'd like to welcome you all to today's event, Preparing for Flooding and Cyclones in a Time of COVID-19. Before we start, however, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which I am speaking from today, and that is the land of the Ngunnawal people. And I acknowledge the Ngunnawal elders, past, present, and emerging, and thank them for the contribution they made to the ACT Emergency Services Agency and the safety of Canberra. I note that a number of you are joining this online event from across Australia, and many of you will be on the land of other nations, of which there are many in Australia. I acknowledge all of our First Nations peoples on whose land we are here today. Well, welcome to what I think is going to be a very exciting and a very important event in a time across Australia where La Niña watch status is keeping us all very interested. The prospect of an increased likelihood of floods needs to be considered in conjunction with our regular cyclone season that sees many of us very busy throughout the summer across Australia. This is also against a backdrop of increased extreme event intensities as a function of climate change. This comes at a time when we are also challenged by COVID-19 and the implications and restrictions that places on us. And this is likely to continue both across Australia and internationally, and for us, may have an impact on flood, cyclone preparedness, response, and recovery. So today's activity, it aims to raise our awareness of and convey information about the prospects of La Niña season with increased flood risk, along with the practicalities and the challenges faced by COVID-19. This will place additional challenges across the emergency services and the other agencies that we work with and work for, our communities, service delivery, and how we will manage pre, during, and after a flood and cyclone event. So, preparing for floods and cyclones in a time of COVID-19. Thank you very much for joining us. So, without further ado, I'll move on to introducing our speakers. Our first speaker today is Dr. Stephen Crimp. Stephen is a climate applications scientist with the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University. His role is to examine opportunities for improved climate risk management within primary industries, both in Australia and internationally, as well as seeking opportunities to work more closely with multinational and global food producers, telecommunications, and other industries in this area. Steve, I invite you to address your audience this morning.
Thank you very much, Georgina, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen because I have 1 or 2 slides that I'd like to share with everyone. So we'll keep our fingers crossed that that all works. I hope you can see that now. Can someone give me an indication they can see the PowerPoint? Yep. Okay.
All good.
Good. Thank you very much. So today, yes. What I wanted to talk about today was the prospect of or the risk that a developing La Niña might pose to rainfall and potentially localized flooding in Australia. So as Georgina said, the Bureau of Meteorology announced La Niña watch in July 2020, and this has strengthened to an alert status in September. Even today, there was discussions from other climate research groups across Australia saying that there is a 94% chance of actually experiencing a La Niña event this year, or the remainder of this year. So as we know, in the presence of La Niña events, there is an increased chance of widespread flooding. And if we look back historically, at the last 18 La Niñas that have occurred since the 1900s, and we look at the average patterns of rainfall that have occurred when we put all of those events together, what we see is that of those 18 events, 12 of them have resulted in floods over parts of Australia. And there is a link there for those of you who would like to go and actually have a look at the Bureau of Meteorology's website that actually highlights each of those events. But in addition to those, the sort of the 12 events resulting in flooding, we have generally with La Nina events above average rainfall, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail very shortly. But the East Coast during La Ninas generally experiences about twice as many severe floods during La Nina years than during El Nino years. And typically during La Nina years, the northern parts of Australia experience a heightened number of tropical cyclones making landfall. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail very shortly. So in terms of La Ninas, La Nina events tend to begin in autumn. They mature during winter and spring and early summer, and then they start to decay later in summer. This is probably not your typical La Nina type year because the La Nina sort of status has started later in that period than normally or would occur on average. If you sort of look at the pay attention to the maps below, the three maps there, these are historical rainfall maps that have been aggregated for 13 different La Nina events. And the rainfall has been ranked from rainfall in the bottom 10% through to the top 10%. So decile 1 represents really low rainfall events in that bottom 10%. And the very dark blue at the top represents the sort of top 10% of rainfall events. And so you can see on average during June and October, from these 13 events, you can see that over the majority of Australia, rainfall is in the top 30% in terms of the actual rainfall amounts. And you can see even higher sort of in that top 20 and top 10% in some locations in the north, in Queensland and central New South Wales. By October to December, those areas of very high rainfall in that top sort of 30% have constricted somewhat to the northern parts of the country. So the majority of Queensland, the Northern Territory, and the northeastern parts of Western Australia. But there are still some localized areas over Victoria and New South Wales where the rainfall can still be in that top 30%. Then by February to April, we are sort of moving back to sort of normal rainfall conditions for that time of the year, although there are some areas where rainfall could still be in that sort of top 30% across the Northern Territory and parts of Queensland and New South Wales and Victoria. So the question that I suppose we have to ask ourselves is, for this season, what sort of strength is La Nina going to be? Because the strength of the La Nina really determines how much rainfall we get. And the way that we determine the strength of the La Nina events is by looking at how strong the sea surface temperature patterns are in the Pacific, or we look at how strong the atmospheric circulation patterns are using what we call the Southern Oscillation Index, which is the difference in pressure between Darwin and Tahiti. And the little sort of scatter diagram that you see on the right-hand side plots the rainfall from April to November against the April to November Southern Oscillation Index. So you can see that when the Southern Oscillation Index is greater than 5, so that's indicating La Nina conditions, you can see that overwhelmingly there is strong rainfall anomaly. So much larger rainfall than average. And you can see there's highlighted there was the La Nina of 2010, the La Nina of 1950, particularly strong, around 15. The SOI value was around 15 over that period, and resulted in significant increases in rainfall above the average conditions. This year, currently, the Southern Oscillation Index is hovering around 7. That's the average over the last 90 days. But over September, we have seen values of 12 to 15. So we're starting to see an intensification over that September period. So the wettest years that we have experienced during La Ninas have been during 2010 to 12 and 1974 and 1950. And all of those events have actually corresponded with circulation that's going on in the Indian Ocean, which is where the eastern part of the Indian Ocean, so adjacent to Western Australia, is actually much warmer than the western part. And this is called a negative Indian Ocean dipole. So when we have a negative Indian Ocean dipole and we have La Nina events, the Indian Ocean dipole tends to enhance the rainfall that we get during those La Ninas. Now, currently, the Indian Ocean dipole is hovering around negative 0.5. Now, the scale is from plus 1.5 to minus 1.5. So just to give you some indication of where we sit in terms of the Indian Ocean dipole. So if we look at the Bureau of Meteorology's forecast for the October to December period, if we first focus on the chance of exceeding median rainfall, the blues and the green areas are showing where there is a high chance of exceeding that median rainfall. And you can see over much of the eastern half of Australia, there's the sort of 70 to 80% chance of exceeding median rainfall. That does drop away in the November to January period. You can see that map at the bottom right-hand side. But you can still see the eastern seaboard still is around that 60 to around 75% chance of exceeding median rainfall. One of the things that you can do from the Bureau site is you can also look at the chance of exceeding specific thresholds of rainfall. So in this example, I've chosen 300 millimeters of rainfall falling across the October to December period. And what you can see in that top right-hand side is that there are regions that sort of go through the sort of Victoria and the sort of higher rainfall zones of New South Wales and into Queensland, where the chance of exceeding 300 mils of rainfall over that October to December period is anything from sort of 75 to about 90%. So some sort of a likelihood there of getting some extreme rainfall events coming from the Bureau of Meteorology. So just to end the presentation, I did talk about earlier that during La Nina events, there is a chance of more tropical cyclones actually occurring. And in fact, there's typically twice as many landfalling tropical cyclones during La Ninas than El Niños. And we find that the first cyclones cross the Australian coast a little bit earlier in the season during La Nina events than during El Niños. I would draw your attention to the link at the bottom of the page, which is an outlook, a long-term outlook of tropical cyclone activity for Australia. It's actually been released today. I'd love to say it was in conjunction with this event, but these things have happened sort of independently. But I draw your attention to that because that's showing that there's the forecast is indicating about a 60% chance of actually experiencing 3 tropical cyclones sort of along that sort of east coast region this season. So I'll end things there and thank you very much for your attention.
Lovely. Thank you, Steve.
My pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll ask you to hold your questions till the end of the introductory session. We'll have a Q&A at the end of our fourth speaker. So 94% chance of experiencing a La Niña event and likely to have potentially up to 3 tropical cyclones, Steve. So thank you very much for that, that positive news moving forward. We'll move on to Rosemary now. Rosemary Heckner is the Director of Capability and Planning at Resilience New South Wales. As the Director of Capability and Planning branch of Resilience New South Wales, Rosemary's portfolio encompasses emergency risk management, capability assessment, training exercises, evaluation and state emergency operations. And she works very closely with key stakeholders to ensure that the community of New South Wales receives the best service possible from our response and recovery agencies. Well, quite an extensive portfolio, Rosemary, and I welcome you to address the audience.
Thank you so much, Georgina, and my sincere apologies today. I didn't realise that Zoom was not allowable on our network, so I'll send some slides through later for distribution if you'd like that. So I think from my perspective today, you know, I actually have a background in emergency management as an intensive care paramedic registered nurse and coordinating the whole of health response to emergencies. So some of the discussions in the previous La Niña sort of hit home for me, particularly thinking back to 2011 where we had all of the southeast flooding and flooding across Western New South Wales. And I guess from my perspective here in New South Wales and in the capability and planning portfolio of Resilience New South Wales, the focus really is to look at how can we be better prepared for the future. And so a significant piece of work that we've been looking at is something called the Capability Development Framework. And that capability development framework is actually looking at understanding, you know, our response to a catastrophic event. A severe catastrophic event in New South Wales could be quite obviously significant. We've seen a major event occur with the recent bushfires across lots of areas, but this particularly in relation to La Niña is starting to flag concerns for us with regard to flooding. If we look to the capability framework and the purpose of doing that, it's about working out at a state level what capabilities the emergency there need to be in emergency management. We've identified 25 of those, of which flooding is one discrete area that we've been looking at. Storms is a separate discrete area, but different, slightly different, same but different. We've also been looking at the process for identifying where the gaps are within our capability in New South Wales and looking through how to define those different capabilities. And we have used some methodology that will be able to be repeated, but we've got 25 core capabilities, but within those 25 core capabilities, we're looking at them from a how do people, resources, governance, systems and processes. And when you're talking about people, you're talking about personnel with the skills required and the training to be able to deliver on what it is we need to respond to these events. Talk about the resources, both the physical equipment and the procurement practices that may be required for stuff that's not actually owned by the organisation. Look at the governance, about the enabling factors such as legislation and funding arrangements under the emergency management for responding to such significant events. We look at the systems of data, IT, financial and workforce management plans, and then fundamentally the processes and documentation of how we're actually going to do it all. So when we talk to the core capabilities, they're actually influenced by risk. And so in New South Wales, there was a discrete piece of work called the State Level Emergency Risk Assessment, which was produced some time ago, and it identified the core risks to New South Wales in terms of emergencies and disasters. And I think it's important that if we need to understand our risk in order to answer two simple questions. And the two questions we need to ask are, what do we need to be prepared for? And how prepared do we need to be? they're easy to look at in hindsight of a bushfire event, but we still haven't trialled this in the context of a flood event. So we identify the 25 core capabilities and at the state level to prepare, prevent, respond and recover from these disasters, and we're using the capability framework to drive our way forward. So if we put it in context now of the discussions today and the increased likelihood of a La Niña event occurring, I'll move to one of my favourite places, which is the Hawkesbury Nepean area. So the Hawkesbury Nepean Valley area is a area of Western Sydney, which is a unique piece of geography, which fundamentally was the origins of the colony of Australia in the Windsor area for its farmlands, its beautiful flood zones, sorry, just a little distracted there, for the beautiful growing conditions. A large portion of the market gardening is done in that particular area of Sydney, and cropping and exists. So fundamentally, what we've got is we've got the Hawkesbury Nepean. It has its tributaries of the Nepean, Lake Burrinjong Dam, Gross River, the Colo River, McDonald River, South Creek River, Eastern Creek. Now, what you may or may not be aware of is in that area, we have the Warragamba Dam. The Warragamba Dam is currently at 98%, and if we're starting to see a significant rain event, it could potentially be quite a spill of the pathway. The unique piece about the Hawkesbury Nepean is it's like a big bathtub because of the rivers and so forth. It's prone to flooding because of the geography. It's limited evacuation pathways. We've done some studies to identify the people who live in those areas say it's all right, should be right, and there's a very low awareness of risk. And I think the big piece of work that we've been doing with the community is to talk to them about what is the chance of risk. It's, this 1 in 100 has largely been misconstrued as 1 in 100 years as opposed to 1 in 100 chance. And so to that end, what do we do when the rain comes, and how do we plan now, particularly that we've got COVID? So we've developed a set of guidelines called Evacuation Management Guidelines for COVID Supplement, which really takes into account a lot of planning assumptions, which are about evacuations being a strategy of last resort, maximising the notice of evacuations if we need it, so we can actually prepare to maintain all of the health requirements and social distancing. It's quite a challenging thing to think of when you have mass evacuations. How do you actually manage that within a COVID restrictions? And I'm conscious that I've probably run out of time, and I will leave it there and potentially speak in the breakouts.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Rosemary. Look, and I think the capability and development, sorry about that, office phone ringing in the background. I think the capability and development framework is something that'll be of interest to a number of people in the audience. I reflect back on my time in defence and looking at what we called fundamental inputs to capability and how they can be influenced by risk, and being very evidence-based in our approach is certainly something that not only the community but government will be demanding of us into the future as our resources are very much stretched. So look forward to the Q&A during that phase. So we'll now hear from Daniel Austin. Daniel is the Deputy Commissioner of Operations at the New South Wales State Emergency Service. In this role, Daniel leads the development and delivery of operational capabilities. As the Chief Executive Officer of the New South Wales Registered Training Organisation, Daniel is also responsible for the standards and compliance elements of the training function of the agency. Again, quite a significant portfolio. I'll hand the floor over to you now, Daniel.
Thank you, Commissioner, and likewise I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that I am on, which is in Wollongong this morning, and they are the Tarawal people, and we pay our respects to them. I've just tried sharing my screen. This may or may not work. Time will tell if there's anyone out there that can give me a vague nod to say it has or has worked. There goes the thumbs up. We're taking a step forward. So I guess the aim of my presentation is to build on what we've talked about so far. And very much for us as a response-focused organisation, or traditionally a response-focused organisation, we've spent a lot of time over the last few months in particular, probably back to about February as COVID started to really emerge, actually looking at what the impacts were going to be. And we're quite proud of an organisation as being one of the leaders in getting the discussion started in the work that Rosemary was talking about around having a set of COVID evacuation guidelines for New South Wales and how we would work in that space. It is very much about, for us, about looking forward to look backwards. So every year we are actually looking at, hopefully that's changed slides, very much looking back and seeing what we've seen in the past and how we've dealt with that, and so on and so forth. And you can see in the top corner of that slide, in the last 12 months, or 12 months that was 1920, we actually spent some 301 days operational, as in having boots on the ground, dealing with significant events. That doesn't include the one truck response down the street to the average call out. That is significant operational activity that encompasses the whole organisation. So a part of our planning is also not only around what do we do potentially down the street, how do we deal with community, but also how do we make sure that from a business, we actually have the ability to continue all the things that we need to do. And I had the joys of being involved in a peer review a few years ago under the AFAC umbrella. And one of the comments that was made to us by a small community was, it's all well and good to get the public information to us and so on and so forth, but then if you don't pay the bills in the timely manner, you may as well have actually burnt us out and we not have survived. For us, it's very much about making sure that those backroom business functions can still operate at the same time, that we can still pay the bills, the community can still exist as we go. But as Stephen mentioned, there is a lot of focus on what the rainfall will do over the next few months. We can see significant similarities between events that were 2012 and 2016, which produced significant flooding in Western New South Wales and also up and down the Murray Basin. So we've been working already with particularly Victoria SES on arrangements around how we would deal with anything that may pop up along the Murray-Darling Basin, but also doing a lot of work planning for what may come for particularly that greater Western Sydney, that greater Western part of New South Wales, should that occur as well. And those floods out there traditionally are slow-moving, long-duration floods that I guess the media interest goes out of exceptionally quickly. And you need to be able to continue to maintain the positive messaging and knowing that you're actually losing some of your potential media outlet interest to get those messages out there. So what's COVID done for us particularly? COVID for us has meant we've spent a lot of time looking, as I mentioned, in those backroom functions, but it also is about making sure that we spend a fair amount of time in a different environment looking at how we do community engagement and building that community resilience. Ordinarily this time of year, we would have something like 100 to 150 community engagement activities going on almost on a weekly basis. In terms of being physically out there on the ground, holding your corner street meets and all those kind of things, COVID's pretty much put a nail in that for us. And that is something that we are trying to restart quite significantly. We're also looking at what can we do in an alternative forum. So how can we continue to spread those messages? and make sure that we can make sure people are aware of their risks as we go. It also, COVID has played an interesting fiddle for us when it comes to our response capability. You may be aware that there was an outbreak or a cluster in Bateman's Bay, and it just so happens that some of the crews that were responded to one of our flooding events happened to dine at the same place that the people who were infected with COVID happened to go and dine at. That actually took an entire brigade from the fire service offline for a period of time. So it's about thinking, where do you feed people? Where do you actually watch people? Where do you stage people? All those kind of things as well. And for us, New South Wales, we're lucky. Our borders, except to Victoria, have remained open. So we always had the ability to bring in additional crews from interstate if required. The challenge for them was always going home. And if they did come here, would they have to spend 14 days in isolation? The news that South Australia opens its borders back to us tonight actually provides a little bit of relief in that space as well. So a significant amount of planning has gone into what may come this year. As I said at the start, we're lucky. We have a good culture here where we build on the lessons of the past and we understand what we have been faced with. But this time, there's just a slightly different slant on what we have to think about. So, Commissioner, back to you.
Daniel, thank you very much for that. Certainly, adjusting to the new normal is the key. I don't think we can use the terms unprecedented anymore. And we really do need to demonstrate to the community that it's a time for and of innovation, and particularly how you are adjusting to the COVID-19 environment in order to maintain capability. I think this is a lesson there for all of us. So thank you for that. Lastly, Jo Killick. Jo is the General Manager of Liaison and Recovery at the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. She has extensive working knowledge within QRA, having worked in various roles throughout the organisation since March 2012, including working with local governments on major acquittal programs such as Cyclone Yassi and STC Oswald, and as a Regional Liaison Officer. Within her work, Jo is passionate, as we all are, about engaging with communities across Queensland, with a particular focus on Indigenous local governments and working with them to recover and reconnect after natural disasters. Thank you, Jo, and I would welcome you to address the audience.
Thank you, Georgina. Can you hear me okay? I think we can. Okay, I'll try sharing.
Oh, good.
All right, I'll try sharing my screen now as well. Is the screen share working okay?
Yep, we can see that, Jo.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, as I said, thank you very much for having me. And it's really always interesting listening to the insights from other jurisdictions and how they're dealing with things. So I look forward very much to the rest of this discussion as well. So today I just wanted to talk about recovery from the Queensland experience, using an example, and also touch on a few of the other parts of our space, so preparedness and response as well. So just wanted to put this slide up. I know it's very busy and you might not be able to see it clearly, but that kind of highlights the point we're trying to discuss. So since 2011, more than 80 disaster events have impacted Queensland communities, predominantly cyclone and flooding events. In this time, Queensland's administered around $16 billion in funding related to those. And while we haven't seen an event like COVID-19 before, QRA in Queensland more broadly well practiced in responding to and recovering from natural disasters. And I think it's important to note that the basis for this well-practiced model includes that locally led government-supported approach to both response and recovery, and the forming and maintenance of those networks at all levels of government and across the community. And of course, as climate change accelerates, the intensity and duration of disaster events are likely to continue to increase.
Sorry, we can't see that slide that you're referring to, slide 2.
Okay, I'm not sure what.
It might be that we're sharing the wrong screen because we just see your slides in the PowerPoint view as opposed to the slideshow.
Okay, all right.
So if you just stop, maybe stop sharing and maybe share a different screen.
Okay.
We'll just try it again. Thanks,
Sorry,
Joe.
everybody, I knew this would happen.
That's okay. It happens.
What about? How's that?
That's perfect, Joe. Well done.
Sorry, that's the slide I was just talking to. Can you see that now? That's slide 2?
Yes.
Yep, that's perfect.
Yeah, okay. Apologies, everybody. So yeah, as I said, that's it. That slide's really just about highlighting the breadth of and the types of the events that we've been dealing with in Queensland after the course. So the example that we wanted to talk to today was our 2018-19 season, which was really a window to the future. We had 12 events in that one year, and obviously the cascading and compounding impacts and consequences of those impacts tested our ability to respond and recover. The season included 5 cyclones, catastrophic bushfires, which was the first time in Queensland's history we've had that catastrophic bushfire. Ironically, the second time was the following year. We had heat waves during this disaster season, 40 days over 40 degrees in much of the state. And for 60 local government areas of the 77 in local government areas in Queensland, it was their second major event within 2 years. So the large events have triggered changes and evolution for how we as a state think about our ability to absorb and withstand and adapt and transform really our communities in the face of these multiple disasters. So I guess one of the events of that season we're talking about was the North and Far North Queensland Monsoon Trough, which was a 1 in 500 year monsoon event and ultimately impacted 50% of the state. With the event spreading west, the flooding spreading west, impacting communities already dealing with 7 years of drought and who were in the midst of that heat wave that I mentioned. We also saw complexity of cascading and compounding impacts on things like weakened stock, weakened livestock, weakened communities because of those multiple events. And of course, the economies in those areas are also reflecting the complexity and the multitude of events hitting them. The Deloitte report into this event estimated the social and economic cost of the trough at $5.68 billion. 3,000 homes damaged, 300 kilometres of railway line damaged, loss of 500,000 head of livestock, 40,000 kilometres of local and state roads impacted. So it impacted the people and the communities, the infrastructure, the economy, and of course the environment. So as a result, you know, our planning laws, riparian zones, evacuation routes, and of course again the economies were all challenged and in some instances close to being overwhelmed. So we need to recalibrate our thinking, policy settings, response and recovery arrangements where necessary, just to ensure that all of those elements are able to absorb and transform in response to, as you just already mentioned, the new normal. The priorities in recovery from this event, as it is with all events, were the health and well-being of our communities, reconnecting economic lifelines for those communities, and also everything we do in recovery must make us more disaster resilient into the future. So that was that approach to that event. And then of course, click forward 12 months and we're facing the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of our work, the good news being that Queensland is well practiced in recovering from disaster events, and we are resilient as a people, acknowledging that this COVID-19 pandemic is an overlay for all of that. The disaster events that we deal with on a very regular basis have resulted in increasing local government capacity across Queensland communities, which is a bonus and a good basis. So currently at the moment, we've got 3 state recovery plans being implemented. So the 2018 Central Queensland bushfires, the 2019 Monsoon trough, and then the 2019 Queensland bushfires. So those 3 events impacted 55 of the 77 Queensland local government areas. So on top of those 3 plans, Queensland Government is now working with all Queensland regions to develop regional specific recovery strategies in response to the COVID-19 pandemic across all areas and recovery domains. And we currently have 32 local government areas who have sought QRA assistance to create specific local recovery plans for COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of preparation, Queensland's developed an evacuation management guide for COVID-19 to manage those evacuation activities across the state within a COVID-19 environment, as New South Wales were discussing as well. And all of our district disaster management groups are undertaking an exercise with that dual event focus prior to mid-October, which is when we sort of typically kick off our season up here. So in responding to and recovering from acute shocks such as floods, fires and cyclones, I think it's important to recognise that the health of the underlying social and economic systems in disaster impacted areas, that does affect its disaster resilience, the ability to absorb and bounce back, tied to the understanding and management of those chronic systemic issues. And in terms of resilience, historically, we've invested just 5% in mitigation from natural disasters. And however, after the monsoon trough, we're looking at closer to 20% investment in resilience. And that has been event driven. Disasters have highlighted a need and investment has followed. But the demands on response and recovery can't get in the way of investing in disaster resilience beyond the breadth and scope of a particular event. So learning and moving forward, we need to make sure that we're prioritising our investment in the things that really matter in terms of disaster resilience, and finding ways to work together outside of our traditional networks to deliver investment that achieves multiple benefits. A strategy that focuses on connecting people across government boundaries and professional disciplines to identify shared solutions to common problems. And in terms of preparedness, Get Ready Queensland is QRA's preparedness program, encouraging Queenslanders to be aware of local risks and to have a household emergency plan. And this year that has been revised and is being revised in terms of the communications to have that COVID overlay. And we've already, previous speakers have mentioned the practicalities around evacuation and evacuation centres, and the differences that this season will place upon those processes. This year, Get Ready Queensland's partnered with Suncorp to enhance the program, and rugby league legend Jonathan Thurston is our ambassador for Get Ready Queensland. So happy to talk more about those things when we get further through today. So I think I'll just leave it there, short and sweet. Thanks, Georgina.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jo. And a lot of what you've just commented on resonated with me. I had the privilege of presenting at the Whole of Government Effective Consequence Management Program yesterday at ANU, and a key topic of discussion was how does recovery remain agile and also informative to shape future processes. And certainly looking at testing our capability, and the comments you've made about prioritising investment and the engagement and interoperability across various agencies and departments certainly is echoing the comments of a hot topic of conversation yesterday afternoon. So thank you for that. So we're moving on to the Q&A section now of this morning's presentation. So a couple of instructions on how we're going to achieve that in a virtual environment. If you'd like to ask a question, please do so by using the raise your hand function. If you click on the participants button on the tab at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the raise your hand button. Our tech assistant Lamis will then unmute you one by one to ask your question. Please remain on mute until Lamis enables your microphone. I'd also ask that you keep your questions as short as possible to allow us maximum time for our speakers to answer, and so we can get through as many questions as possible. So if everybody's ready with your raise the hand buttons, Lamis, I'll hand over to you to enable the Q&A section.
Wonderful. So we've got no raise your hands as of yet. So if any of the speakers have questions that they'd like. Oh, we've got one. Here we go. We've got Gary. Gary, I'll ask you to unmute and you'll be able to ask your question.
Thank you very much. Gary Yule, the Assistant Chief Officer for Gippsland in Victoria, SES. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for your presentation. Very, very informative. If I can direct my question to probably Daniel and Joe, because it's sort of two ends of the spectrum. How are you approaching the fatigue in your communities and in your agencies in respect to the continuous elevated sense of drama that's gone on across the country over the last 12 months. So we've moved through one of the busiest bushfire seasons, we've gone into COVID, and now we're elevating our thinking. Just interested to understand how you're approaching the fatigue of responders in community. Thank you.
Great question, Gary. Look, in some regard, the fact that COVID drove people into a level of isolation, responders' perspective, has actually provided a level of respite. Some of the, I guess, more mundane tasks that you might see occasionally have perhaps not been quite as forthcoming, and there's almost been a level of community resilience. Some things that we perhaps haven't noticed before. In terms of getting our message across to the community and I guess cutting through really what has been quite a negative news cycle over the last 6 odd months and even longer if you go back into the bushfire, that has absolutely been a challenge. And it's about exploring different ways of doing things. I mentioned this time of year we would have ordinarily had a whole heap of people out doing a lot of face-to-face community engagement capability work, where we just haven't been able to actually do that. So it's been looking for different ways and means. And some of the stuff that we've done recently includes launching a whole heap of educational resources for schools to actually allow teachers to pick up some of that and educate schools. And we spent quite a bit of time working with a university here in New South Wales to develop those so they really did hit the mark. Rosemary mentioned Hawkesbury and Nepean, clearly a significant focus for us. Always is one of the biggest flood risks in Australia. But that's actually been ongoing work for us. It's not anything new in that space. It's just been phase 2 and so on and so forth. But it is an absolute priority for us at the moment to try and release from the COVID restrictions to get community engagement back on track and actually get people to understand their risk. And I think we've been supported quite well by people like the NRMA, who have launched what they call First Responders Day, which is the first Saturday of each month, that actually highlights the community taking a level of responsibility for their own issues and their own risks. So I guess it's not been one thing that we've done, it's been a whole range of things and a whole range of stakeholders working together.
Hi, it's Jo. Just in response to that question, I agree with what Daniel's saying. It's about having to adapt, I think, is the big thing in terms of the community and the fatigue that the community are feeling. It's about maintaining recovery programs that we've got underway from natural disaster events in terms of mental health and social support and that type of thing, and adapting the methodology for delivering that support. has been a big part of what's gone on in the last 6 months because, you know, as we've already discussed, it really is typically a face-to-face engagement. And in terms of that Get Ready Queensland and adapting the preparations for that, as I mentioned, we're sort of changing the messaging a little bit, but we have also gone to alternative engagement, so smaller community information sessions and workshops. Schools are a really important and valuable tool, particularly in Queensland when you've got Jonathan Thurston's face on things. People get involved, sad as that might sound, but it's true. And adapting sort of emergency kits and information about them. And we've also, because of the border closure situation in Queensland, there's a lot of Queenslanders who are on the road within Queensland in areas that they're not normally. So if they are up in the Cape or visiting the Daintree or going out back, they're not around their normal environments and their normal support systems. So we're also adapting our messaging to make sure that for people who are on the road and travelling and getting out and about within Queensland, that they have got, you know, adapted messages and up-to-date messages about the differences in terms of, you know, responding to things in a COVID world.
That's
Thank
awesome.
you.
Thanks for that. So next we've got a question from Sue Ford. So Sue, you should be able to unmute now.
Hi, I'll just put my thing on. Yeah. I just had a question around how you see the COVID overlay being managed in evacuation centres. I know it was mentioned that's going to have to be taken into consideration, but I just wondered if there'd been any sort of planning around that, because just because I do a bit of volunteer work with the setting up and sort of evacuation centres and that response. And I know that some of them, especially in the smaller areas in New South Wales, actually don't have enough space for social distancing. And there's a few other challenges as well. So I just wondered if there was any information around that or how that was going to be managed.
I'll take that one. It's Rosemary Hegner speaking. So just from a New South Wales perspective, there is, in fact, an evacuation centre management guidelines COVID-19 supplement that's been published and is on the Emergency New South Wales website. At this point in time, there's been a lot of work being done by the State Welfare Services Group, who are focused on doing a review of all of the evacuation centres for their suitability for managing evacuees. But further to that, they've also training up to 1,000 staff across New South Wales in the COVID practices. So there's a massive amount of consideration going into this, particularly in the early stages. We've broadened the normal way of doing business into utilising other government partners such as Service New South Wales to act as our call centre point of contact, particularly when New South Wales had people self-isolating at home. If they had have been evacuated, we needed to have a very clear picture of how we would manage their evacuation from a facility. So we've spent a fair bit of time with the key stakeholders to work through that process, and that's available on the web.
It's also fair to say, Sue, we've had 2 cracks at it now. So we had 2 East Coast lows about a fortnight apart that hit just south of Wollongong down through the Nowra area. And it was a change of messaging. So it was no longer about go to an evacuation centre. Messaging quite early on as the rain started to fall, and in fact even before it, was about an evacuation centre is your last point, is really your last option. You should go to family and friends, seek alternative accommodation, those kind of things. And I think out of the places that we actually did evacuate, we ended up with only 1 presentation actually seeking government-sponsored accommodation. So people were actually hearing that message as we were putting it
Okay, thank you. That's great. I'll look for that resource on after this is over. Thank you.
Wonderful. So next we have Scott Hamilton. Scott, you should be able to unmute now.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to sit in today on the session. I'm with the Country Fire Authority Victoria. I'm the logistics lead in our pandemic management unit. So that's where I'm coming from with this question. In regards to, I suppose, operational response and recovery for events, and it doesn't matter, fire, flood, whatever the incident, has anyone been actually done any exercising? And I suppose I'm interested in what lessons have been learnt from it, from when we're drawing down in our say our rural communities, response and recovery, and how the have impacted on one another, especially within the COVID restrictions now. Has anyone had any experience in that?
Scott, that's a great question, and I guess I can only come from the paradigm of actually living in a country community. Fortunately for us, we haven't had any sort of major incidents occur at this point in time in those country areas, other than sort of down the south coast. And from that perspective, what we tend to watch is that because the incidence of COVID is very low in those areas, the psychological paradigm that they're operating from is it's all right, it's not in our district, so it's okay. So of course, from a responder perspective, we just need to make sure that all of our staff have the appropriate training and PPE to manage any such incident. So that's probably the best I can give to you at the moment.
Wonderful. Did any of the other speakers want to address that question? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next one. All right, we might move on to the next question then. Thanks, Scott. So next question is from S. Wilcox. So you should be able to unmute.
Hello, it's
Okay.
Sesh. Hello.
Yeah.
I'm down in Lutruwita, Tasmania, so hello from here. My question is around communications. I'm a communications and engagement advisor for a local government council down here. And I guess it's probably more directed at maybe Joe and Rosemary, but I was involved in helping one of the councils with the bushfires in 2019. And I just wondered how it's going in terms of communications channels, how the central and all the agencies are interacting with local government communicators, because we're the ones on the coalface, if you like, in trying to get out those messages in an interesting and engaging enough way to attract our local communities, because they are quite different. Yep, thanks.
Hi. Oh, go. No, you go, Rosie.
Oh, no, that's fine. So, look, it's not my area of expertise, but what I can tell you is that I guess a positive spin on the bushfires is that we had systems and processes in play before COVID really sort of started to play out to such a significant level. And because those systems and processes were in play, we'd already established really good communications with our Deputy Premier, who was leading the bushfire response. And we've kind of brought the two bushfire and COVID stuff together because they affect communities, you can't distinguish between bushfire affected and COVID. So we've got very closely relationships with the councils and the staff here at Resilience New South Wales have regular catch-ups with the GMs of councils to make sure that there's a continuous messaging going through. Our comms people here at Resilience are sharing messaging across with all the key stakeholders so that we're coordinated. And I'm sure that our recovery coordinators are actually working very closely with the councils as well. So I'll let.
Hi, Joe again. So just in adding to that, I think that for us in Queensland, like I mentioned earlier, the basis of our practice and everything that we do in both response and recovery is locally led and linked to local gov. So in terms of actual messaging and things like that, I know that it's got to, you know, we all know it's got to be a combination of things. So different means and methods of putting that messaging out there. So whether it's social media, whether it's you know, where you can have your sort of your normal face-to-faces, ensuring that messaging is there. QPS, QFES websites and Facebook pages, all Queensland government pages, including QRAs, have COVID-specific places to go for information, and it's a constant. We have, you know, state disaster coordination group meetings which involve all the mayors across the state online, and I think too at a local government level on disaster dashboards and things that local govs have on their websites, which a pretty high number do in Queensland, that messaging is also repeated and all the links, so that everything is linked up and it's the same message and it's consistent, so that people can access it no matter, you know, whatever form that they are comfortable using it. But I think, you know, maintaining that network and those relationships at local government level is crucial, and that's the basis for everything that we do.
That's wonderful. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end the question and answer session there and go into breakout rooms now.
So I think with the different breakout rooms, we're going to report back. Is that, I mean, as I was in the comms breakout room, so I can quickly go back through the kind of key, some of the key points that we had in that. In terms of communication. So one thing was a real focus on just-in-time messaging. Another thing was in terms of evacuation centres, trying to encourage people if they need to leave to go to family and friends first and foremost, rather than to evacuation centres. We also talked about in the ACT. Scott talked about how it was important to do principal risk assessment, to manage a workforce, and to really be very focused on what the guidelines were and doing risk assessment before doing any activities. And the final thing, sorry. The final thing was to be a lot more engaging with our social media.
Lovely. Thank you. We'll now move on to Stephen Dovers to give us his back brief.
Okay, I actually only just made it back. I somehow dropped out of the meeting, so apologies, I missed the other group. Look, we got very much, I think, into operational matters. A few things that came up, the management of incident management teams and incident control centres, how those pretty intense places can work under COVID, and there were some insights and lessons shared from around various jurisdictions of the use of more dispersed models and the use of different kinds of spaces. So rather than the regular spaces, actually going to new kinds of areas like clubs or university facilities. And it seems that there's a lot of learning on the run, really limiting incident control centres to key people and then dispersing out. A number of issues came up around borders and different lockdown areas. So some lessons, I think, out of Victoria. I think that was where people coming, operational people coming from different lockdown areas, lockdown zones actually created a bit of a problem. The question came up at the end, very relevant one about surge capacity or interstate sharing of resources, where if there are border controls or if there are other things. So it did appear that there's very, rapid learning on the run. So the topic of how those learnings can be shared when personal contact communications have changed. But it was put that actually going online in this sort of COVID time has actually made some of that cross-agency and cross-jurisdiction communication happen, in fact, more and more easily. So it'll be interesting to see how that post-COVID, whenever that is, that some of the changes in operations and practice forced on us may actually stick with us. Though the tip was also that keep the old telephone conference in your back pocket in case your fancy new Zoom doesn't work. So I think from our group, just some getting down into some of the sort of wicked detail of having to change some of the really basic practices like how IMTs work, how communications work, and some pretty encouraging news of very good lessons being learned.
Great.
I hope that's...
Thanks, Stephen. Just got to move on. We're running out of time, but thank you very much for that feedback. And so we'll move on to Mark now for your feedback.
Thanks very much, Georgina. I had a really positive group with good contributions from everyone. Some of the key messages were about those establishing virtual emergency relief centres and virtual management of incident control centres, just like Steve Dover's just mentioned, and Leah Hepworth from Victoria had a good example of that. But other things which came up, which haven't been covered by others, is really important to particularly look after the support staff. So many of these are over 65, so they're an at-risk group and so more vulnerable to COVID. And so there's recognising as differential risk across your staffing groups. And so that's an important thing there. And one of the other things pointing out was important to learn from each other and learn from what's happening in the US as well. And so there's apparently a lot of lessons that can be learned from there, including elements of community resistance to actually helping out volunteers and firefighting services, etc. And the last point was as things sort of COVID rates go down, there's a risk of people just getting very lax and lazy, and so continued vigilance, eternal vigilance is needed.
Eternal vigilance and learning on the run. Thank you very much for that. So we'll move on to now Claire or Anna. I'm sorry. I think, did we have Claire up earlier or was it Anna? I've confused the names. I'm sorry, ladies.
So I think Claire spoke. I haven't yet. So a very quick rundown from our group, and I'll just concentrate on things that haven't really been said before. So a very good point was made that while we're concentrating on this near-term issues of La Niña and COVID, the example was given in South Australia, this ongoing development in a floodplain. So that's, building in risk and vulnerability for future emergencies. And the focus has totally been taken away, by these current disasters, and the focus on responding to what's happening now has been taken away from those long-term issues. So we also went through, and other groups have talked about the changing operations of the IMT. In our group, we've discussed how the operations of emergency responders will change, and that's, as somebody mentioned, learning on the run. The way that standard response has been done is going to have to be adjusted in the light of COVID. And we also talked about putting training and community information campaigns online as well. And the focus was a lot about what can we do, in terms of prevention, so that we don't have to get to the point of evacuation. So that's it from our group.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Anna. And Mark, I think, or Steve, who have I missed? Any of you?
Yep, sorry, it's me, Georgina. Firstly, my apologies to Claire Turrell. So we got cut off as we were coming back into the group session. But there was a discussion around the idea of virtual community meetings, which everyone else has touched on. The only cautionary note there was that those work in areas where bandwidth is very good. So if you are planning communications with those virtual meetings, you need to have a stepwise approach where you might have the real presentation, a real-time video, then a recorded message, then slides with some audio, and then just text, depending on the bandwidth in those communities. The other alternative to the virtual community meetings was an example from Victoria, which talked about drive-through response centres, and those being used to capture people's details and where they were planning on going, or to offer them accommodation or other advice. So I think that was another opportunity. One of the other things that we did discuss was this idea of within institutions, the home has now become an extension of the office. And so there is ways through institutions to raise awareness through existing networks, which are non-traditional in terms of emergency response. And there was an example by Sue from ABS in terms of the sorts of communications that have been set up for the next survey. So it's an additional 35,000 staff. So there are some examples of where institutions can also be used to raise awareness about the unfolding events long term. So that is about it from me.
Lovely. Look, thank you so much for that. I wish we had 4 or 5 hours today, because certainly it's been quite an informative 90 minutes. So we started off today, ladies and gentlemen, with 4 fantastic presenters: Stephen Crimp, Rosemary Hegner, Daniel Austin, and Joe Killick, who pretty much covered the full gamut from our intelligence and situational awareness as to what's happening with regards to the climate and the impact it's having on our environment and weather patterns, which triggers the role for first responders. And then we looked at preparation, prevention, preparation, response, and recovery. And certainly what we started to see was some themes emerging as to how do we maintain good practice in a COVID-19 environment, culminating with our small working groups, where the themes that were coming through: leverage off our existing networks, but be agile and adaptable in order to maintain our capability. How do we maintain our connectedness with the community, particularly in a time of COVID-19? Looking after our staff in the IMTs and our first responders, whether that be how we maintain effective operations, but also mindful of the vulnerabilities of some of our first responders. How do we maintain effective incident management? We shared some ideas for models for change. We looked at how we could have a surge capacity, but the one theme that came through time and time again was risk. Undertaking risk assessments, understanding priorities, and then maintaining and optimising capability throughout the full gamut of pre, during and after emergencies in a COVID-19 environment. So thank you again, one and all, for attending our activity and for the breakout room discussions. We'll be taking the feedback from the group discussions today and using them to inform a report that we'll be writing, and the report will be emailed through to all attendees once it's published. I've seen a lot of information shared on the chat room today. Please grab those websites and internet advice. Look out for the report. Thank you, I noted, to the 188 people that dialed in this morning, and I could see a number of recordings of today's event, which I'm sure will be shared widely. Thank you to ANU and AFAC for putting what has been a fabulous 90 minutes together. And I look forward to the SES Operations Working Group and Climate Change Group really leveraging off this connection we've established today into the future.
Thank you, Georgina. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for participating today.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye now.